Hello, everybody, and welcome back. And thank you to Anna and Darren just then. Next up, we have a municipality panel looking at unlocking the hydrogen economy. So welcoming Eamon Nolan, who is the partner at Vinson Elkins, also the silver sponsors of today. Eamon will be joined by executives from Uniper, from ENGIE, the Hydrogen Council, as well as the Minister of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. As before, there is the option to do questions and answers. So if you look to the side of your screen, there is a box there. Please do drop in your questions. They will go straight to Eamon and he will be able to direct them to the panelists. Alternatively, visit slido.com and use the acronym FOR 2020 or the hashtag, and that will give you access to the Slido platform. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Eamon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Hello and welcome from wherever in the world you are tuning into this today. My name is Eamon Nolan and I'm an infrastructure development and finance partner at Vinson and Elkins in New York, with a particular focus on clean energy project financing. I'm particularly excited about today's topic, the universe's most abundant element, hydrogen, because the development of this technology could play a major part in the energy evolution, as we have seen on a number of our recent deals. A big thanks to Reuters for putting together such a fantastic event this week with extremely impressive presenters throughout the program. And today's hydrogen discussion is certainly no exception. I'll hand it over to each of today's panelists to introduce themselves, starting with the Honourable Kwasi Kwarteng, the UK Minister of State for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy. Minister.
Hi, how are you? It's good to see you all. Can you hear me?
We can.
Great. Look, I think the hydrogen economy clearly is something which has aroused a huge amount of interest. Really, I think 2020 has seen a marked increase in activity, not only in the UK, and I'm referencing the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, but also we've seen a hydrogen strategy published by the EU. We've seen one by the German government. I'm very pleased to say that in the UK, we will have one published in the first quarter of 2021 next year. And there's a lot of excitement, understandably, about the production of hydrogen and its uses across industry, in transportation, and also in people's homes, its potential use there. And of course, if successfully deployed, the hydrogen will lead to a strong lever, will be a very strong lever for decarbonisation. So I understand fully the excitement around this new industry. The real trick as ministers and as public officials that we have to work out is how we can actually encourage the private sector to invest in this new technology. We've seen a huge success, I would say, in the deployment of offshore wind. I don't think anyone anticipated in 2010 that we would have nearly 12 gigawatts of installed capacity, that the UK would have nearly 35% of the global capacity in offshore wind. And that's been a huge success through contracts for difference rounds and through the auction process. I think the challenge is trying to get the same alchemy, the same circumstances, really to drive the hydrogen economy, particularly on the production side. My own view is that demand is already there. There's a lot of demand, lots of people who want to have hydrogen. It's just the crux of the problem is how we can produce it cheaply and economically, and that's where the private sector really has a role to play.
Agreed. Thanks, Minister. Michele Azalbert, CEO of the Hydrogen Business Unit at ENGIE. A quick introduction from you as well.
Thank you. Nice to be here with all of you. So as you said, I'm leading the hydrogen business within ENGIE, dedicated to renewable hydrogen.
Thanks, Michele. We've got Andreas Schierenbeck, CEO of Uniper. Andreas.
Yeah, hello everybody, and great for having me. I think the hydrogen topic is a real exciting thing at the moment. Uniper has started hydrogen already in 2012, as we used the first renewable energy to use hydrolysis to produce green hydrogen, and in 2015 then green methane. So we are in that quite a while. It's good that finally I think we're having the final push for the hydrogen economy, because one thing is clear, and that's why we are betting on that quite heavily. If you want to decarbonize our society, you need more electrical energy for a lot of sectors. And for the things you cannot decarbonize with electricity, you need hydrogen. chemical industry, and so on, that there are some processes as only way using hydrogen with that. And the demand for that will be great. If we really honestly want to fulfill the Paris Agreement 2050, we have to ramp up the hydrogen economy now. It will need definitely until the 30s that we can really have an impact there. Maybe it's faster, but hopefully. I think Michele is hoping as well that it will be faster, but that will be the only way to decarbonize our society going forward. On the other hand, I don't know where I've read it, but I've seen a quote that said a new source of energy needs about 3 trials and around 30 years to make an entrance to the markets. I think this is the third time, and it's around 30 years since the first time we have seen hydrogen making an entrance. So let's hope for the best. I'm convinced that will happen.
Thanks, Andreas. And Daryl Wilson, Executive Director of the Hydrogen Council, if you'll just quickly introduce yourself as well.
Hi, a pleasure to be with you today. I joined the Hydrogen Council just 10 weeks ago, and prior to that was the CEO of a hydrogen technology company for 14 years. So I've been in the sector for some time, and what a tide and difference has happened in the last year. Many people are asking if this is another hype cycle in hydrogen, which happened long ago in the 80s and 90s. I can assure you it is not. When I look at the scale of commitment from our now 100 members of the Hydrogen Council, we started with just 13 members in 2017, now 100 members, and the scale of industrial commitment and investment, we're just counting the numbers now late in the year, but I think it exceeds 100 billion, and the public sector commitment's close to 50 or 60 billion. I can assure you we're not into a hype cycle, we're into the real deployment of hydrogen at mass scale, which is a very exciting opportunity.
Thanks, Daryl. That was actually going to be a lead-off question for me. You know, we obviously have seen some false starts in the hydrogen economy over the last 50 or so years. You know, it does feel a little bit different this time out. There is a very significant combination of governments and private sector focus pushing to bring industrial scale hydrogen to market. There's obviously the EU's Green Deal targeting a 55% reduction in emissions against 1990 levels by 2030. And their plan is to put 6 gigawatt of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers in the EU by 2024, with additional up to 40 gigawatt of capacity by 2030. So Michele, perhaps over to you. What do you see are the major impediments to success this time out? And what are the major impediments to the development of industrial scale clean hydrogen projects today?
Thank you, Eamon. We are clearly facing today an unprecedented momentum for hydrogen. And part of the success factors for industrial scale clean hydrogen development are already present. However, some additional pieces are required today to kickstart at scale and deliver the ambition you mentioned. Many countries have announced significant ambition on hydrogen, and these are very good signals. This is the case of Europe, of Germany, of France, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Korea, Chile, among others. And indeed, subsidies are necessary to bridge the competitiveness gap in the early years between the cost of renewable hydrogen and grey hydrogen, and also to support the supply side. And recent announcement with a related support scheme and mechanisms such as contract difference are going into the right direction. But it will not be sufficient to deliver the ambition. 3 additional factors, according to us, are to be taken into account. First one, we need to give visibility to the market to foster investment decision in the short term. And we need regulatory frameworks to that end, to set up roadmap to decarbonize the energy system, and also to set up roadmaps with clear decarbonization targets for the industry to create the demand. Second, we need to develop fast and at scale and focus on industrial scale projects that will enable, again, to trigger the cost decrease and reduce the competitiveness gap. The faster we go to trigger this price decrease of electrolyzers, the less support we will require in the long run. And last, third point, having the best technology ever will not be sufficient for the takeoff of the hydrogen economy. To scale up their manufacturing processes, the electrolyzer suppliers need orders, and they need orders from developers. And developers need to take an investment decision. And for developers to take investment decision, what they do need, it's again visibility through subsidies and regulation in order to take this investment decision. And developers are key in order to activate the hydrogen economy at scale. Why so? Because they can identify, they can align all the pieces of the puzzle. They have the ability to find the customer and to engage into long-term contract, ability to obtain the subsidies and the support we need, and also ability to find partners, equity partners, financial partners, and to invest together with equity partners in order to build and operate this integrated solution, complex integrated solution, and manage the complexity for the customer. So, and to this regard, ENGIE, we are acting as a developer, and we have a pipe of project with a few of them quite mature, and we are ready to invest in them. And starting in 2021, provided that we get the effective support we need.
Thanks, Michelle. Andreas or Daryl or Minister, I don't know if you had anything to add to Michelle's views on the constraints there, or
definitely. I know I can only agree with Michelle's statements. I have an equal view to that. I see already this year that the prices for hydrolysis equipment has fallen more than we thought, in the area of 20-25%, if my numbers are right. So this is something which was not expected. So hopefully we see the same trend like with renewable energy, that's becoming more and more competitive, rather faster than we thought. But we need definitely subsidies or contracts for difference, because the price tags at the moment are not in the favor. If you talk about currently for gray hydrogen, costs around 1.5 euro per kilogram production. That's, I think, the bottom of that. If you go for blue hydrogen, it's 2.1 euros per kilo. But green hydrogen, which depends more on the price of energy, that has to be renewable, in Germany will be around 7 euros a kilo. If you take some taxes out, then you're around 5. This is still way away from gray hydrogen. So my thesis would be, we need to have some subsidies there to kickstart that. We should start with converting the gray hydrogen production to green or to blue or to turquoise one. And I would say we have to give way for open technology acceptance like blue hydrogen or like turquoise hydrogen, at least for a time being, as most countries actually are doing it in Europe.
Thanks, Andreas. I want to come back to the economics a little bit more in a moment. Minister, perhaps I could just go to you for a moment. From your perspective, what combination of policies are going to be needed to overcome some of these economic constraints, and how important will international government coordination be to the success of this push?
So I think that, just on the second point, I think there is considerable support for hydrogen across different nationalities and across different governments. And there are absolutely forums which I've taken part in, not just with colleagues and friends in Europe, but also all over the world. I mean, if you speak to the Chilean energy minister, if you speak to the Japanese, if you speak to the Chinese as well, they're all interested in ramping up hydrogen capacity. I just was speaking to the governor of Maine in the United States, and she expressed a real interest and ambition in terms of the hydrogen economy. So there's a lot of people might term hype, a lot of momentum, a lot of interest in this. I think what's been identified is the first point you make in terms of how can we actually land this. I think Andreas made a very good account of the differential, the cost differential between producing green hydrogen or even blue hydrogen and grey hydrogen. And there clearly is a role for government to play in trying to encourage private sector investment. Now, in Britain, we had a very good experience with offshore wind, whereby we had an auction, a CFD, contract for difference rounds. We've had 3 of those rounds now, and we saw the price really for offshore wind tumble from something like £120 per megawatt hour to £39 per megawatt hour, and that took place over 8 years. And I think if we have the right incentives, if we use the CFD potentially in renewable hydrogen, I think that you could see or replicate that process in the manufacturing and production of green hydrogen. So I think it's a question of finding the right commercial incentives, the right structure to be able to allow the market and private capital to be deployed in developing this technology.
Thanks, Minister. So Andreas, just coming back to the point you touched on the economics, it'd be interesting to unpack a little bit some of the sensitivities to the economics, and particularly what is going to be the biggest drivers in reducing those costs. Obviously, we've talked a little bit about the government intervention and assistance that might be needed there, but what else is going to bring that down? How sensitive are those economics to things like the cost of electricity production, a country's ability to produce rather than to import its own hydrogen? In an open forum here, but I'd be interested just to hear each of the panelists' views on those sensitivities and how they can be tackled.
Earlier this year, the hydrogen industry released an extensive report on this issue of cost and scale up, and you can find that on the Hydrogen Council website. The key driver here is scaling the industry, as was shared earlier. If we can start to see the demand for the key units of electrolysis moving up substantially, the industry has shown that there is a very clear profile of a learning curve similar to wind and solar. Wind and solar, of course, is now into millions of megawatts of deployments, and the hydrogen industry is still sitting in the hundreds and thousands kind of range. So several orders of magnitude smaller. As we start to have deployments that are larger, the costs come down very significantly. So in the first instance, we're seeing learning rates in the 10 to 20% per year level, but as things continue to scale, we'll approach the learning rates that we're seeing in wind and solar of 20 and 40% reductions. And so the pathway is there, and there's not actually a technology scale up a constraint here. It's more creating the demand. And I would point out, noting our audience today with a heavy focus in the renewables area, there's a very synergistic link between ongoing integration of renewables on the grid and hydrogen. I remember working with Uniper back in 2010 on the first power to gas project, where they had great foresight in realizing, we're getting up in Germany at that time above 10% renewable penetration. And clearly there was a need to relieve some of the grid constraints associated with integrating renewables. And electrolysis in particular allows for the absorption of more renewable energy because it's a storage pathway. And at the second level, it's also a means of stabilizing the grid, which is very much needed with more renewable integration. So there's a lot of synergy here in scaling the renewable energy and ongoing deployment of renewable power generation and beginning large-scale deployment of hydrogen. These two things go together, and the economics on the hydrogen side will be strongly advantaged by the scale-up.
Thanks, Daryl. Michele, Andreas, please.
Yeah, maybe let me add to that. What we will see as well in the hydrogen economy, how it's developed, there will be countries who are exporting hydrogen, and there will be countries which will be importing hydrogen. Additionally to the local production, there will be this kind of economy being developed as well. Germany has not enough wind and not enough sun to produce all the hydrogen they need. They are anyway at the moment an importer of primary energy, magnitude of 70%, and we go to 80 if it's shutting down the lignite mines. So we will have a need to import hydrogen. Other countries will export that. And the export definitely means we need transportation. And transportation is one of the open questions for me, because there's no standard. This is not an easy thing to do. It's much cooler than LNG. It's much more difficult. And I think here I'm seeing some room for improvement and development to set a standard and kickstart that, because that will be essential in our way forward.
Thanks, Andreas. Michele, did you want to add anything there, or?
Maybe just some more details about the regulatory frameworks that would help to give visibility to the market to foster investment again. I was mentioning the setting up of roadmaps with a clear decarbonization target. Giving a target like that to the industry and mobility sector, like percentage of hydrogen usages, will help definitely to create the demand. And the second factor second element is with regard to the decarbonization of the energy system. Again, roadmaps will help. Certainly to set target like injection into the gas network may help also to create long-term demand and to support the market, the kickstart of the market. Also create implement storage obligation may help. As we see, it will help also the energy system in the long run. So preparing for that will help. And lastly, implementation of the traceability system, like a guarantee of origin, will help in order to distinguish the various colors of hydrogen and also to put a value on it.
Thanks, Michelle. Minister, I'll come to you in just 1 minute because I want to talk to you about some of the policies that your government's released over the last little while. But I just want to go back to one point, Daryl, that you were touching on there, which is the synergies with the renewable industry. And obviously there is a significant audience that with us today that is part of the traditional wind and solar renewable industry. So obviously we heard on one of the other panels yesterday, I think, that obviously the electrolyzer market is going to be a significant driver of demand for wind and solar developers and projects around the world. Obviously, relative to corporate purchasers who have a little bit more flexibility in the way they go about buying their electricity, electrolyzer operators are very constrained and need to go to that market. How significant do you think that's going to be for the wind and solar market over the coming years?
You're talking about the purchase of electricity by utilities.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I think those countries which have a strong renewable energy natural endowment, whether it's wind, offshore wind, or solar, are going to be the first movers. So we're seeing lots of activity in Chile, for example, which is the one of the most heavily irradiated places in the world from a solar point of view. So these will be lead markets because of the concentration of access to economically attractive renewable energy. But as those kind of first leading locations start to scale the industry, the whole cost structure and the support for the industry will continue to improve and open up more markets. So I think that we'll see leadership in high renewable energy penetration markets, and then following other markets as well as costs come down.
Thanks, Daryl. So, Minister, your government announced a series of policies designed to make the UK a leader in transitioning to net zero by 2050, pushing for 2 million green jobs, 5 gigawatts of low carbon hydrogen production capacity, and aiming to develop the first town heated entirely by hydrogen, all by the end of the decade. These announcements were obviously accompanied by funding commitments. You mentioned earlier, obviously, the private sector is going to need to play a significant role in partnering with government. What do you see as the significance of the private sector role there? What do they need to do to help your government achieve those milestones?
So the one thing that the figure that we said, or the Prime Minister mentioned, was the fact that across the 10-point plan, and hydrogen was just one of the 10 points, yeah. Something like £12 billion of government investment would be mobilised. But on top of that, more crucially, up to 3 times that amount would be mobilised from the private sector. And as I've said before, if you look at the success of offshore wind that we've had in terms of the deployment and the increase in capacity, that has been driven very largely by private sector investment. And that private sector investment, that private capital, was attracted by this auction, this CFD process that I described. So the trick, as I've said, is to try and get a funding mechanism, an incentive structure, whereby the vast resources of the private sector can be brought to bear to drive the production capacity in hydrogen and also in CCUS. We haven't mentioned CCUS, but of course CCUS is the flip side of the blue hydrogen production.
Yep.
So in these new technologies, we are figuring out a way, much like we did with offshore wind, to incentivize private sector investment, because we firmly believe that there's no government in the world that can just simply pay its way through taxpayers' money and direct government spending to the green revolution. There has to be a large measure of private sector engagement and involvement.
Thanks, Vince. You touched on something important and interesting there, I think, which is the relative technologies in green and blue hydrogen. So just open question to the panelists. I mean, how do you see those technological advances unfolding over the coming years for both electrolyzer capacity and CCUS? Relative economics obviously involved there as to driving those costs down. Which is the more exciting technology from your perspectives? Is one likely to take the lead over the other? Do you see them both having a significant role?
I mean,
so of course sorry, go ahead.
No, not at all.
It's not a race, it's about economics and it's about scaling. And it's not necessarily about excitement, it's about practical execution. So one of the first observations is it's important to understand that hydrogen is not a whole new industry. In fact, the global hydrogen industry is valued at some 18 billion annually already. Or no, sorry, 218 billion. So it's already a very sizable industry at industrial scale. That scale all exists today in hydrogen coming from fossil fuel. And alongside of that has developed the carbon capture and storage technology and capability, which complements the existing large-scale hydrogen industry. So the cost advantage initially is going to sit very heavily in that because of the current existence of the industrial industry focused on that side of things. And scaled carbon capture and storage has already been built in many locations in the world. As the green hydrogen side of things starts to mature, we do expect that there will be a crossover point, and that may not be too far in history. We'll be releasing a study from the Hydrogen Council in the new year that looks at decarbonization pathways and makes some indication of when that crossover point will come. And as we move more toward 2050, the vast majority of installations will likely be green hydrogen installations coming from renewable power generation. So both of these vectors are needed if we're to realize the ambition we have around decarbonization. This is not an either or horse race. This is a both and necessary journey. And if we're going to meet our targets, we have to bring both of these streams along, because in the first instance, blue hydrogen has the scale and the economics to start the journey quickly and get the kickstart. And then as we scale the green hydrogen things, where there's all the policy support and the aspiration, the expectation that will happen, then we're going to see green hydrogen prevail in terms of the economics in the long term.
Maybe yes.
Sorry, Michele, go ahead.
Yes, sorry. Maybe just one additional comment to what Daryl said. We think that we need both, and we need both in parallel. And we've also renewable hydrogen. You would achieve two objectives at the same time. You not only develop a hydrogen-based solution to decarbonize the industry and to achieve the Paris Agreement objective, but also you continue to increase the share of renewables in the energy system. So you do both at the same time.
Let me add to that. There's one big advantage for blue hydrogen, because, and I think Michele mentioned it already, the network is already existing for blue and turquoise hydrogen. The gray hydrogen is building on that, and it is easy to produce hydrogen where actually natural gas is already produced. Then, of course, you divide the CO2 out of that, put it just back where it belongs, underground, and have a mixture of hydrogen and natural gas to be transported by pipelines. Most of the pipeline system can take up to 10–20% hydrogen or even more. Our storages, and we have around 8 BCM storages in Germany alone as Uniper, we can use these for hydrogen storages. So we are playing with that. It's already there. It's something which is available. So that's a big asset. And of course, I'm an electrical engineer, but of course I know that an electrical line can take less energy density than a methane pipeline. It's about 4 times as much. And if we are really getting this right, then there is enough room for blue, turquoise, and green hydrogen. And I'm completely with Daryl. In the 2050s, I think the green hydrogen will prevail at the end because we have enough renewables there. But in the meantime, I think it will be not an either or. It will be a combination of that, of costs, and trying to get the cost down to a minimum. And I think there's room for enough hydrogen of all colors from my point of view.
Thanks, Andreas. So just touching, Daryl, perhaps on something you mentioned there, obviously there is a very significant existing market for hydrogen. I think the IEA estimates that demand for hydrogen in its pure form today is about 70 million tonnes per annum. Over 95% of that currently comes from grey or brown hydrogen, which emits significant carbon dioxide, about 830 million tonnes of CO2 per year. So, you know, with all this talk of a hydrogen tsunami, which does feel very real at the moment, I think there's probably two things to unpack there. One is there is the existing replacement, and two, obviously, there is the additional demand. And I'd be interested to hear from the panelists just in terms of what you see as the ceiling for hydrogen demand as an overall contributor to the energy mix, and where do you see specific industries? What do you see as the specific drivers of that surplus demand above what we have today? Open to the floor.
I think in principle, we always need to start the answer to that question about conservation. So the global energy appetite is too much, and anything we can do to reduce our energy consumption is absolutely a priority, and I think the hydrogen industry shares that priority. Next, we need to thoughtfully deploy each of our energy assets in a thoughtful way. Some of the strongest pathways for hydrogen are to decarbonize the hard to decarbonize sectors like making steel, glass, many industrial processes which use hydrogen today. Ammonia fertilizer is another example. And if we can decarbonize some of those pathways in a significant way, the contribution in terms of tons of CO2 mitigated is very, very significant. And there really is no other viable pathway to move in those sectors. So this is a very high priority for the industry. And we're starting to see the announcement of very large scale projects that will do just that. And the first announcements in the steel industry, for example, of steel companies embracing a fully decarbonized pathway to make steel using hydrogen as an input rather than traditional coking coal. So I think things are moving already in the right direction, and this is an asset allocation and prioritization issue. And we've been working on the side of the Hydrogen Council to show these pathways, to show where the biggest bang for the buck can be realized, and where we can prioritize where to act quickly and first.
Very good. I mean, I just thought I wanted to add just something on that. I mean, as I think Daryl said, it's not a competition between green and blue. I mean, in the first instance, we want to ramp up production capacity. And even though I fully accept the idea that, as Daryl said, that there is a hydrogen market already there, as other people have observed, that market at the moment is not consonant with our net zero ambition. So the only way we're going to actually you know, kind of decarbonize hydrogen, ironically, is through carbon capture. So in the first instance, given the scale of the market that already exists, we feel, certainly in the UK, that there must be a role for blue hydrogen. And blue hydrogen, in effect, can be a transition towards green hydrogen. But one of the things that I think marks our strategy compared to that, which I've read of the EU and our German friends, is that we're very keen to emphasize both the production of green hydrogen through electrolyzers and electrolysis, and also the production of blue hydrogen, which is a concomitant of carbon capture. And they're essentially part of the same process. So at the moment, we want to do both. And we don't know what will happen in 2050, okay? We don't know, no one here can say what the relative price of the production of green hydrogen and blue hydrogen will be in 2050. Nobody knows that. But in the first instance, given the scale of the existing hydrogen market, it does make sense to look at the possibilities very closely of blue hydrogen production.
Yeah, as you say, it certainly comes back to the relative economics and technological advancement.
Yeah. And let me add to that. You mentioned the colors of hydrogen in Germany and Europe. I think what I can say is what I see, that of course Germany is in favor of green hydrogen. That's the most subsidies which are poured into that from a strategic point of view. And of course, it's clear that the production of blue hydrogen in Germany is at the moment not possible because CCS is not an approved technology. And from my point of view, it wouldn't make so much sense because we don't produce actually natural gas, but we are importing quite a lot. And importing blue hydrogen and using it without subsidies is something which is accepted in Germany. And the production of turquoise hydrogen, where you take the black carbon out, is definitely something which is supported even without subsidies. So from that point of view, it's a little bit more complicated in Germany. I understand some technologies we always have a favor or not unfavor for that. But from the bigger picture, I think we're going in the same direction as our colleagues in Great Britain or in the Netherlands, where blue hydrogen definitely is one main pillar of their strategies.
No, that's well put, I think.
This opens up the discussion about transport, and let me just touch about that briefly. Moving energy around our world is something that we've always done, and hydrogen is not dramatically different as an energy carrier to some of the energy carriers that we use today. We have oil and coal and LNG on ships, and indeed there are programs under development now between Australia and Japan and Saudi Arabia and other countries to move hydrogen in bulk ship methodologies, either as ammonia or liquid hydrogen or other liquid organic carriers, are all under examination. And indeed, the amount of energy per ship approaches the level of what we're moving on the shipping lanes today. In terms of pipelines, there are already thousands of kilometers of pipelines in the world supporting the industrial hydrogen economy that exists today. And so pipelines are not a new thing for hydrogen. And I think, as Andreas said earlier, it's very interesting. If you look at some of the difficulty of moving energy in power lines, vast amounts of energy can be moved in hydrogen through corridors. I think of going from the north of Germany to the south. It might be far easier to put a pipeline of hydrogen in existing pipeline right-of-ways rather than trying to run more electrical transmission lines, which are strongly opposed often by the public. So the news with hydrogen from a transportation point of view and a transmission point of view is actually good news. We know how to do this. We have the corridors and the methodologies. And indeed, the technology is mostly ready. There's some development to do on shipping, and that work is already started by some of the world's largest energy shipping companies in Japan and Korea. But the good news is we know how to do this, and it's possible.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. It's a good point, and I was going to touch on this a little bit. Obviously, there are some efficiency issues in terms of long-term, long-distance transportation, and certainly some efficiency issues in storage. While some of those technological leaps, I guess, are being or gaps are being narrowed, do you see any benefit in hydrogen hubs or localized hydrogen kind of networks and business centers that are places of specific hydrogen activity as being a short-term highest and best use for hydrogen? Or do you think that those problems of transmission and storage are solvable enough and not impactful enough to not warrant that sort of approach?
Hydrogen has this characteristic as an energy carrier that it can work down a large number of vectors. So today we kind of have the three solitudes of heating our homes with gas and keeping the lights on with electricity and putting petrol in our cars. Hydrogen could do all three of those jobs. And so the integrative and holistic aspect of hydrogen favors the development of so-called hydrogen valleys, where the various, we call this sector coupling, where the various modalities of the way we use energy can be all mobilized using one energy carrier. So that's a very strong, attractive, holistic nature of hydrogen. And we've seen initiatives in the UK and elsewhere in Europe where locations have been identified as being very suitable for hydrogen valleys. And may I say, those often occur in close proximity to a high national endowment around particular renewable energy generation. So you put strong renewable energy attributes like offshore wind in the UK alongside these multiple pathways with hydrogen for the use of energy, and you get a very complementary ecosystem. And that's why there's now work underway and looking at more than 40 different locations where these hydrogen valleys could grow up. But that does not negate also the notion of transporting hydrogen over longer distances and importing hydrogen. Those kind of activities are also underway in parallel.
I think it was not really so obvious for most of us or for the public that there is a hydrogen economy, as already from Daryl highlighted, but as well there is, in Germany, there are a couple of thousand kilometers of hydrogen pipelines for industrial hubs. They are not connected to a complete network, but there are storage capacities, there are networks, they're going from ports to industrial centers. So others can be converted, as Daryl said, so it's not a difficult thing to do. And on the other hand, I think what is probably very interesting to look into it is really the housing sector. If you're using hydrogen as it's in some concentrations for that, we could use fuel cells to generate electricity and heat at the same time, which makes it very efficient from my point of view, because fuel cells always generating heat. And then, of course, heating and electricity generation makes perfectly sense for me. And it's a great tool to decarbonize that sector, which is actually pretty hard to decarbonize because this is an existing building stock. This is one of the most difficult things. And we will come to that sooner or later, and then we have to tackle that. And I think this is one of the approaches where I believe using the network, heat and electricity generation with fuel cells makes perfectly sense from my point as an engineer. If you're getting the cost right, that could be a very good thing to see.
And if I may also complete from a financial perspective, if you develop, implement this kind of holistic approach, it's part of the business model because you really capture all the value creation level of hydrogen. And at the end of the day, the total cost or the total value is greater or total cost is lower. So it's clearly also one of the most effective way to develop the hydrogen economy through this kind of hubs, serving different type of customers. And then at a later stage, being interconnected between them through hydrogen highways, through pipes, for instance, and having also big storage developed in order to address the question of intermittent renewable power.
Thanks, Michele. Minister, did you have something to add? Yeah.
I mean, what point particularly did you want me to address? I mean,
sorry, I was going to ask another question, but I thought you had something to jump in on there.
No, I mean, not
okay.
away.
So look, I'll put one to Andreas and Michele, I think in particular. I come at this as a project finance lawyer, and the way in which financial markets look at development of large-scale infrastructure projects is obviously, there's a lot of things that they want to see. One of them is long-term offtake contracts, significant long-term sources of revenue that are not subject to disruption in other than in the normal ways, as well as technological certainty. In your engagements with financial markets, and I know both your companies are speaking to banks regularly about different things that you do around the world. What are you hearing? What are you seeing? And what do you think they need to see in order to want to finance a lot of these large-scale projects?
I can start. The key component is a long-term offtake. Today, to develop a project and also to kickstart this kind of hydrogen hubs, you need long-term offtake, and you need to anchor your hub on long-term offtakers. And then you are in a position then to align again all the pieces of the puzzle to attract the subsidies you need in the early years, to also attract partners, be it equity partners or financial partners, in order to build the asset and to make it happen.
Yeah, look, I think you're completely right. I mean, there's what we call a chicken and egg problem here, because clearly you need some government involvement to help the industry on its way and develop, but also you need private sector engagement to actually deploy the capital and increase the scale at a rapid clip, if you see what I mean. So it needs a bit of both, and I don't think one can land a large scale hydrogen economy without support from the other. So it's a dialogue between government and the private sector, which you've described very ably.
I think let me add to that. We need to create the demand, and for that we need the government to really spark the demand, because if the demand is there and it's increasing due to rules and regulations or higher CO2 prices or other things, then of course the offtake is guaranteed, and with the offtake, then of course then you develop this project.
No, but Andreas, I mean it's all part of the same thing, because the demand is a function of the cost. Okay. Yeah. So you know, if we can get the cost down, the demand will increase. I mean, you don't need to be a PhD in economics to know that. So you're quite right. You're quite right that it's both the demand and the supply. But there's actually a lot of interest in on the demand side. You know, I go to industrial clusters. I look at industrial processes. Someone mentioned steel production. There's a huge appetite out there for using hydrogen, but the key is the cost. And that is largely a supply side problem, but of course the supply and demand interact, as we all know.
Mm-hmm. And that's exactly the push for the contract for difference, because what does it do? Nothing else than putting the cost down momentarily to exactly start that game. And then of course you get into that, and hopefully we see the same cycle like in renewables with offshore wind. Right. And then, of course, the whole thing is starting to turn alone. And then, of course, the state can pull a little bit back and leave it to the private businesses to do what they have to do.
The dialogue. That would be a very good outcome, I think, in this industry.
And Eamon, let me pick up on the further dimension of your point around the economics for developers and what's being learned, of course, from the renewable energy industry. All of those lessons apply and can be followed through and realized on the hydrogen side of things. And speaking about, we've talked about stable policy, and we've talked about the stable offtake, but risk, of course, is always a major consideration in the investment side of things. And from a technology point of view, a lot of what we're talking about here is the reapplication of industrial technologies that have a long history. So the production of electrolysis goes back many, many decades. The company that I used to work with started in 1950. And so that from a risk point of view, we're not picking up huge amounts of new risk where there's no experience. And in fact, some of the very normal players that have supported the renewable power generation industry from an insurance point of view have already been backstopping projects around hydrogen, and they have the knowledge and the resource base to evaluate the risk and offer the kind of products that they normally offer into the renewable sector.
Well, what Daryl is saying is
good news.
Sorry, forgive me, is true of a lot of industrial processes. I mean, we could make electric vehicles in 1900. It's just that the technology and the industry developed differently. And you're quite right to say that a lot of the technology we're talking about, electrolysis, I mean, we all did that at school. A lot of these technologies we're very familiar with. It's just, and the one thing that we haven't mentioned, which is extraordinary to me, is the context of 2020, the context of net zero and decarbonization. That's why we're having this conversation. And that's why I would say that the prospect of a hydrogen economy is much more real today because of this impulse to fight climate change and to decarbonize. It's much more real today than was the case 30 or 40 years ago. And that's what's changing things. I don't think there's been a kind of scientific revolution in terms of the processes and the chemistry.
I think that's a good segue to there's an audience question that I'm going to put out there quickly, perhaps one for Andreas, and then we'll wrap with a question on the context. So the audience question, Andreas, what does the market for hydrogen look like as a replacement for natural gas? Is it realistic to expect it to replace it, or will it only be a supplement?
Well, I think from my point of view, I think the natural gas has the potential to replace part of the hydrogen which is used today. And of course, with that, demand will increase. We have a lot of gray hydrogen production in Europe, which is already existing. And one part of the Green Deal of Europe is setting aside 15 billion to replace this gray hydrogen production by blue or turquoise hydrogen For that, you need natural gas. Of course, you need natural gas for gray hydrogen as well, but you have to replace it first with these kinds of installations. And after that, I think if you look at the transportation sector, I don't believe that you can use electric cars for trucks, for instance, or for long distances. The batteries will just too heavy. For that, you need hydrogen. If that is starting, then of course you have a real chance to kick in infrastructure and a higher demand. And that demand will be, from my point of view, in the first time fueled with natural gas because the infrastructure is there. We can use what we have at the moment. Just the charging infrastructure for electric trucks and cars for the German highway system would be an engineering difficulty. Using that with hydrogen is possible from my point of view and more realistic.
Thanks, Andreas. So might wrap with this question to the audience. I think touching on a couple of things the minister mentioned. We don't know what the world's going to look like in 2050. We are at a particular moment in time where decarbonisation strategies are front and centre on a number of government and private sector to-do lists right at the top. What do you think is realistic for the hydrogen economy in the next 3 years? What do you realistically see if we come back and talk about this in 3 years' time as the progress that will have been made in this sector? Minister, starting with you, perhaps. You're on mute, Minister.
Sorry, forgive me. Can you hear me now? From my point of view, what I'm really focused on is making this an investable proposition. Essentially replicating the incentives that we saw very effectively deployed in the build out of offshore wind, and using some of those incentives in both the production of green hydrogen through electrolysis, which I think can lend itself to a contracts for difference process, and also having some sort of framework for incentivizing investment in the production of blue hydrogen and CCUS. So there are three things: there's the green hydrogen, the blue hydrogen, and the CCUS, which is a kind of partner of the blue hydrogen production process.
Thanks, Minister. Maybe Daryl?
If 2020 was the year where we kind of hit the activation button and really got started, I think your time frame 3 years hence is interesting, because it does take time to blend, as the honorable member has shared already, the complementary activity between government commitment on the policy side and some degree of funding, and then follow up on private sector investing. I think 3 years hence, we're going to see the realization of what's being activated in 2020. And at that point, there will be no doubt, because there'll be enough actual equipment on the ground and illustrations of all the things we've talked about today, much beyond what we're experiencing in 2020, that the pathway into the future all the way to 2050 will be clear, because there'll be hard examples to point to and say, look, this was done, this is possible, this is operating, and it grew up in an investment context and a policy context that is sustainable and repeatable. So I think we're in for a very interesting run for the next few years.
Thanks, Daryl. Michele?
In addition, I would say that we are really committed as an industrial player to make this industrial scale project happen. And today we have a project in the pipe. One example in the Netherlands, the first phase is 100 megawatt project. And we are ready again to invest, provided that we find a way to have quickly access to the kind of instrument that were exposed before, like contract for difference, and also regulation frameworks. And with these two kind of setup frameworks, we will be able to invest now and then to have asset on the ground in 3 years' time. So I think it's achievable. Then the question is the speed at which this kind of mechanism will be implemented. And also the other question for me, it's around partnership, because it's a question again of size. It's a question of achieving together this huge ambition. It's a question of scale, and by partnering between industrial partners, setting up these hubs, this platform, where they are meaningful, where they can contribute in the long run to the energy system, but also to pooling different kind of uses, so that at the end of the day, it costs less for the society. Then we will together achieve this ambition.
Thanks, Michele. And Andreas, just to close us out.
Yeah, I can only build what my partners in that panel and just mentioned. I think to kickstart it, the technology is there. From that point of view, there's nothing we hope to invent completely new. We need stable investment conditions as an industry to start with contract for differences, with stable tax rules like in Germany. Some conditions, for instance, because at the moment in Germany, it's not allowed to have hydrogen in the networks because it was never foreseen. It's just some red tape we have to do. And with that done, I think the commitment is there. We need to work together. So I like this part from Michele about partners to achieve the sizable engagement with that. I think the time is right. And if we're not doing it now, then I don't know when we are doing it, because this is everything aligned at the moment.
Thanks, Andreas, and thanks to all the panelists, John. I think we've hit the hour.
Indeed, thank you so much, Eamon, for leading that discussion, and thank you to the panel. It's an honour to host such a prestigious group of executives and to you, Minister, too. Thank you so much.